thank a couple of people. Anthony Cardy, who's here somewhere, there he is, who has printed all these pictures and framed them, which has done, I think, done a fantastic job. Yasser would agree. And Kerry herself, who's being very modest, but the lion's share of the work for both this exhibition and the very large exhibition in Abu Dhabi was done by Kerry. And I think Yasser and I have benefited greatly with the collaboration. I just wanted to, as I think Kerry has indicated in her introduction to Yasser, that he took a circuitous route to Egypt. And I think there's one photograph, which is right behind Yasser there, which is not from Egypt. I think everything else in the show is. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you came to settle down in Cairo and why that has become the kind of the project.
The first time I went to Egypt was as a Watson Fellow after graduating from college, and I didn't know a thing about the country. And I spent a year and a half trying to learn about it. It took my breath away. If you've ever been to Cairo, I think it's very hard for the city not to take your breath away or not to totally disgust you. It could be one way or the other. But it took my breath away, this city. The breadth of the kinds of people who live there and its history and social history, the kinds of architecture and the hustle and bustle. And Cairo reminded me very much of New York City in the context of the Arab world. And I didn't know it, but I had fallen in love with that city. When I came back to the United States, I basically wanted to find a way to return to Cairo. I didn't know exactly how to do it. As a Watson Fellow, we were spoiled. We were given a large check and told to go do your project. And the kinds of work that I did without much knowledge of the country, its history, the social structure of Egypt and the Middle East. And I decided that if I were going to do really serious work back in this part of the world, that I had better learn something about this part of the world, at least through books. The fact that my parents are Iraqi didn't give me any kind of into Egyptian society whatsoever. And that's the reason that I studied history and politics at Georgetown University, and I focused on Iraq and on Egypt. And that was a particularly bad time for people who were studying this part of the world. Iraq invaded Kuwait a month before I started my MA. The entire faculty of the program that I was studying were pretty unhappy and depressed about what was going to happen, and then several months later, that's in fact what happened. And I immediately took off as soon as I finished my MA, hoping to go to Iraq. I ended up in Jordan. This was the only way really into the country at the time. But Jordan and I didn't get along very well. Amman felt like a very, very small town by comparison to Cairo. And when I found a way to return to Cairo, in fact I did, and I've never left. And I feel entirely comfortable in this chaotic, bustling, what appears to most visitors as a mess, to me appears as a sort of, frenetic dance that I feel privileged to be a part of.
In the opening remarks, Kerry mentioned that you've had an exhibition in London, you've had an exhibition in Greece recently, Abu Dhabi, but Egypt was missing from that. Could you say a bit about why that is and what the reception of the images has been in Egypt?
The last time I showed some of these images, in Egypt was in the year 2000, January 2000. I had been working on a project that includes some of the images that are here. And I was trying to photograph, let's say ideally, I would have done a portrait of the working class. Of course, that's a fairly heavy task to handle. But what I did manage to do is photograph labor. And when these images were made in Cairo and exhibited, the reaction in Egypt was quite negative. I was told that I'm a foreigner making Egyptians look bad and photographing the wrong kinds of people. And that reaction was quite vocal and quite harsh. And quite painful because it was quite the opposite of what I was trying to do. I was trying to photograph a group of people who are the vast, overwhelming majority of Egyptians who basically suffer from a kind of semantic apartheid in the sense that scholars and experts and academics and government bureaucrats talk about this class of people all the time, but don't really know them. And I had spent many years working on this project, and the reaction for me was quite painful, and I sort of then decided that I'm not going to show these pictures again, or not going to show any of my work in Egypt again. Then suddenly the events of last year took place, and all of a sudden people are at least beginning to look at my work in a sort of different light now that at least the weight of the world is not on the shoulders of the working class, or that there's at least a sense that the working class have an opportunity and a possibility for a better life. They saw these pictures as demeaning. And I see these pictures as a way of shedding light on the people who make the country work, actually function day to day. Without these people, this country would not function.
If I'm hearing you correctly, you're describing the reactions essentially of the middle class to the pictures. What about the people you photographed?
That ran the entire gamut. From people who reacted quite negatively to my pictures to people who liked them very much. But it wasn't just the middle class. In London, I got questions by the Egyptians that so asked, why are you photographing the wrong set of people? That happened to me in Paris. That happened to me, and it's always the Egyptians. There's certainly, at least until January 25th last year, there was an absolute state of denial in the country about the social situation of most people. That's changing now. But it wasn't just the middle class. People whom I photographed allowed me to photograph. But they didn't necessarily always like the images that I made of them. And in some cases, they would ask me to come and photograph them in their homes, or let's say in their Sunday best, which is something that I did, and some of those images are here around us. And for me, that was also a learning process. However, when a catalog was published of their photographs, people all of a sudden loved the fact that they were in a book. And one of the reasons for publishing the catalog in 2000 was to return it back to the communities where I had worked.
Could you say a bit more about how you work? I think that's one of the more complicated contextual bits of information, I think, the images. How you work with communities, how the nature of portraiture has evolved in the work.
Egypt is not a very easy environment to photograph in. And perhaps my guess would, I'd state that Egypt is perhaps the most photographed country in the 19th century anyway. Egypt has an incredibly long history of foreigners going and making photographs. Photography was announced in July 1839. 6 weeks later, 2 men are making photographs around the country. 1839, it wasn't easy to get to Egypt. But there is a reputation of foreigners photographing Egypt, and there is a sense among Egyptians that the foreigners who were photographing outside the canon of accepted sites, which would be the pharaonic sites and the Islamic monuments, that once you step outside of these particular areas, once you step outside of the social settings that are acceptable to Egyptians in terms of photography, weddings, for example, and I'm very fond of photographing weddings, then photography isn't accepted. When I began to photograph in Egypt, there was no such thing as a documentary kind of photography established in the country at all. And if I were going to do that with any sense of trying to express something about this place, then I'd have to be accepted by the communities or the people I photograph. And I work very, very hard to break down the barriers and their prejudices about why and what I'm trying to do. I show them photographs that I've made in the past. We talk. And I spend an enormous amount of time in the community myself learning about what this community is. I'm in a place where I'm entirely off balance, where they're much more comfortable. This is their social setting. And the way that I become comfortable is to slowly, over time, gain people's trust. One way I do that is to return pictures to people so that they see the kinds of images I make. And that's the real work. If I do that honestly, then I can often make a photograph.
Has it been the case, so there's one practical difficulty you've just described, which is gaining the trust of the communities and the social hierarchies. What about the relationship of what you do to the state apparatus? What kind of, if any, interference has there been from that?
The Egyptian state wishes that these photographs didn't exist. Not that they're published in the media. I'm not a photojournalist, so these are not appearing in The Guardian or The Times or in local newspapers in Egypt. In 1986, I spent 3 days in state security prison for making pictures when I was a Watson Fellow. When I was working on the project in labor, people basically identified me as doing something threatening. State security had me followed for several months, broke into my darkroom, took images. Photographing in this particular social setting is threatening to the power structure of Egypt. And that makes the environment very, very difficult to work in. So they wish that many of these images didn't exist according to the way they see these particular images.
In just what you just said, you mentioned that you're not a photojournalist, and one of the points I wanted to also pursue with you was, in many ways, the easiest label that comes to mind with some of the pictures is documentary. And I know that, like you, I'm resistant to that label. And I think it would be quite important, for you to talk a little bit about why you are hesitant about that label. which I think speaks a lot in terms, to me anyway, in terms of what the pictures are really about.
Oh boy. At least for the time that I've been photographing, and Carrie mentioned that I dropped out of the photography program at the Rhode Island School of Design, the kind of work I was doing then and that I've continued in the context of Egypt and the Arab world hasn't been seen by the art establishment as being very avant-garde. At RISD, I was made to feel ashamed that I'm doing documentary work. This is old traditional photography. Get with the program. You want to be an artist, you better, start thinking in different ways now. That work, the work that became prominent in the 1980s and 90s and in the last decade of this century, most of the work produced doesn't touch my heart. I think many of the photographers working ask really interesting questions. But the work doesn't touch my heart like this quote-unquote whatever documentary. And unfortunately, the word has just had this negative shadow cast over it over the last 30 years. But these photographs are, by their nature, extremely connected to the physical world that's in front of the lens. I've tried to make myself equally connected to that physical world. I'm not a passerby in Egypt. I don't want to be a passerby, and I don't want to photograph as a passerby. And if these photographs are somehow special to you, that's because I've connected myself in the same way that a photograph is somehow connected to the physical world that it shows.
Very often when you talk about the images and when you talk about their contexts, the facts of social reality, the facts of labor, economics, social conditions, are very much the terms by which you frame some of the images in your writing and some of the discussions we've had in the past. And yet, in other words, those very terms seem to me to imply potentially a kind of documentary. And yet, when you talk about the aesthetics of the photographs and what you're trying to do, that's precisely what you resist. There seems to be a kind of tension in the way you frame the work.
It's just a lot easier to talk about the social stuff. It's awfully hard to talk about the formal aspects of the images for me. If I knew how to write what I photograph, I'd sort of be a writer. But I don't. And that's precisely why I photograph. And it's so much easier to talk about the technical aspects or the social aspects of the world that I photograph rather than the formal qualities or the aesthetic qualities. And I always leave that to people like yourself.
I mean, I know that a number of photographers have been very important to you. Talk about, I assume, Walker Evans, Cartier-Bresson, Auguste Sander. Could you give some sense of also an Egyptian or Arab tradition of photography? I know you've collected images and you've written on certain traditions of images from Egypt. Is there a way in which there's some connection to that tradition that may not be immediately visible to an uninformed eye? Do you see yourself as having some connection to that?
If there is a tradition of photography in the Arab world, my guess would be that it began in the early 20th century, and that it's mostly a studio tradition. And I've collected the studio photographs partly for what they tell me about Egyptian society, and because it's Egyptians who went to these studios and wanted to be photographed in a particular way and present themselves then publicly in a particular way. And I've been collecting those images to learn about how people want to present themselves. That's the tradition that continued until well into the 70s and 80s. Sometime in the early 90s or so, young Egyptian photographers began trying to make art photographs. And I don't find myself connected to the art photography that's taking place in Egypt now, or that has been going on for the last 15 or so years. If I were connected, I'd be much more connected to that studio tradition. My pictures don't quite appear like that studio tradition, but I'm very much curious about how people present themselves to the camera, and I guess that's one reason why I've collected these studio images.
You work almost exclusively with the portrait. I know there's some still lives, but the 99% of the work is portraiture. And although I'm not especially well informed, but portraiture seems to be the strongest tradition because of the studio photographs. But one of the things that struck me looking at some of the archives as being that until at least quite recently, if you look at the studio photographs and then some of the popular street photography that was done, the surprise photographs, these photographs that were taken by studio photographers in the streets at bus stops and so on. It's actually quite common to have pictures of women in both the studio tradition and in the street photography. But obviously, in your work, that's quite rare. And what has led to that shift? Why is that an issue?
Well, this is the terrible shortcoming of my work. That is, I've had an incredibly difficult time photographing women of the working class of Egypt. That's certainly partly my hang-up. I've gotten into quite a lot of trouble trying to make pictures like that, and I've gotten some women in quite a lot of trouble for having made their photographs, even when I had permission, even when I had permission of family members. And this is a terrible, terrible shortcoming, a terrible reproduction of the same kinds of invisibility that have already existed of the average Egyptian. And I haven't yet succeeded, and you know that I'm working on a project where I'm trying to do family portraits of the working class. And until now, I haven't yet succeeded in making a family portrait that includes the women of the household. I hope to be able to do that, but I haven't yet.
Right with that very one, would a longer lens at greater distance of a candid of women working be a solution or not?
No,
Okay.
not at all.
Because the permission's not there, or even if it was? What if it was?
I use a normal to a wide-angle lens on purpose. I want to be part of the world that I'm photographing. I don't want to, I'm not going to use the right word, but I don't want to steal pictures. That's not quite the right word. I'm not a sports photographer photographing from 100 meters away. I don't want to be a sports photographer photographing from 100 meters away. I don't care if I get the right image. I'm not part of that world. And it's my interaction with the people that I photograph that make these images what they are.
On that same topic, would a woman photographer have the same level of difficulty that you have in photographing?
I know a great photographer in Egypt, a woman photographer, and she's managed to do great photographs of working class women. But she's also the only one who's been able to photo. Maybe she's the only one who's had that interest as well. I can't speak for the other photographers, but she's made some wonderful photographs.
Does that extend to photographing women in general in Egypt, or just your?
No, it's much easier to photograph women of the upper class, and I've had a lot of success. Yeah. And also it was much easier to photograph women in Jordan.
question there?
Yes, on this question of the official aversion to photographs which are, because they're unvarnished or unflattering, there's one sort of note of puzzlement in my mind. I mean, which is I'm sure quite naive, but when Yasser Nasser came to power, came to power on a socialist agenda, and one wondered why there would not be more of an openness to photographing people who are workers, unless they would want photographs that are in a more subtly social realist style.
It's not a naive question, Jim. Actually, I think that during Nasser's period, it was much easier to photograph both the working class and women. You can see that from the magazines that are available at the time, which I'm also collecting because I'm interested in the public image that's presented of Egyptians to other Egyptians. But given the socioeconomics and the politics of the country over the last 25 or 30 years, it's become more and more difficult to step out of the socially accepted spaces where photography is allowed. And that's exactly where I go. People who refuse to be photographed say, well, why don't you go take pictures of the pyramids? And I say, well, everybody's done that. But during the Nasser period, it was much easier, much easier.
Can I ask another question? Sure. Are there any writers, poets or novelists who strike you as embarking on similar efforts to portray the world that you try to capture?
There are, yes, in Egypt. And I often parallel myself with Naguib Mahfouz, not because I particularly like him or think he's a great writer, but he's looked up to in Egypt, and he's, over the course of all of his novels, he's really has his own portrait of the working and lower classes. And when people challenge me about why I'm photographing in this particular neighborhood and am I trying to portray people in a negative light, I say, well, you know, Naguib Mahfouz has written about your neighborhood. Why aren't you upset about his writing? And it's the visual image that takes people viscerally in Egypt.
You were very eloquent about your hesitancy to talk about aesthetic with your choices because they're hard to define while you're in it, connecting to his world. So let me ask a very basic one. Why black and white?
I like it more. Color is harder. I find very few color photographers who use color as an element of composition well. But of all my favorite photographers, there might be two color as opposed to 25 or 30 black and white photographers. So I find the aesthetics more. I also think because it's simpler, that simplicity allows you to look at, for me, the more important things.
Yeah.
I think for anyone who's even briefly traveled through Egypt, especially Cairo, poverty is, and the state of the working class is extremely visible, right? And what I'm curious about is whether you're more interested in exploring sort of the surface or whether your photography is more investigative, kind of looking at the depth of this, you know, like what's really beyond that. Because you describe yourself as somebody who does not want to, who wants to engage rather than just pass by and sort of take snapshots of what's there. So I'm curious about this, particularly because we're talking about a place where this is even more so visible, say, than in other places. Poverty is huge, right? You feel it, even as a visitor. You feel it in your interactions with everyone, whatever it is you purchase or do, right? So I'm very curious where you're situated. There's no judgment, you know. I think both are quite valid.
I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm really not sure I understand the question.
Well, the question is when your subject is it sort of on a surface level, what you see as the state of the working class, or is your approach more investigative? Say you locate a specific neighborhood that's perhaps less accessible to general public, to the middle class, where the middle class does not go. Say, I'm trying to think, say where all the garbage gets recycled in Cairo. What is that?
Zebelin.
Say some place like that where very few people go.
No, that's actually not quite the case, and let me give you, that's an excellent example. That's an extremely poor neighborhood where people recycle garbage. We have basically local garbage collectors who come to my building and pick up the garbage and take it to this particular neighborhood that she's mentioned. It's an extremely poor neighborhood in a part of town that began as just bare hill, and that has grown up to become an entire neighborhood, and for many years did not have running water or electricity and so on and so forth. Well, because of international development projects, that neighborhood has been one of the most visited neighborhoods by foreigners and local NGOs. And the photographs are some of the most superficial photographs of poverty that have been made in Egypt, and yet they're through the, let's say, worldwide NGO system, these photographs are seen all over. There are books on the Zebelin and so on and so, films on the Zebelin and so on and so forth. The way I go to neighborhoods is through personal contacts. I don't have a plan. My plan is about a personal connection with a particular person who lives in a neighborhood, and it's like throwing a stone into water. If I can make a connection, maybe I can make two, and so on and so forth. And in that sense, I don't think it's surface that I'm doing.
Right, so it's something that grows
Yes.
rather than something that you come with from the outside.
No. None of these images were planned in that way.
Yeah. I was just thinking about your political science background and all that, like versus photographic aesthetic, kind of what the approach is.
I studied the politics and the history to learn about the country, rather than anything else.
It is telling that in all the publications of your images so far, you eschew excessive textual apparatus, right? There's no introductory essay that explains the social context. I mean, it seems that it's very much part of the project that the pictures have to speak for themselves, rather than being illustrations of a larger socio-political argument or something.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's what I would prefer. I'd prefer all of you to engage with the work. I mean, I'm very happy to be speaking, but I don't think that I necessarily add very much to your experience of these images. The tiny little film downstairs was an experiment in putting a context to these images. And I did that after the events of January 25th last year, particularly for Egyptians, to sort of recontextualize my images in the course of those events. But I would much prefer that you engage directly with the image and would hope that the image somehow speaks to you directly.
So you had, Jam? Did you have a question?
I did have a question, but I came late, so I'm afraid I missed the full context of this. But I'm just wondering, to what extent are your photographs exhibited in the area in which you're doing your photography?
Not at all. There would be no real place to exhibit them. But I do take them back. That's one of the pillars of the way I've developed in Egypt in terms of working. That is, I try to return images back to people. But in Cairo, we have all of maybe 10 galleries. In any of the neighborhoods where I work, there's no such space where anything could be shown publicly. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does, but I guess I'm sort of focusing on the last portion of your remarks that had to do with what I assumed was an objective to try try to do family portraits, is this not something that just is going to be impossible in the context that you're operating?
Well, I'm hoping that it's not impossible. I've been working quite hard for the last 3 months trying to make it possible. And if it would be possible, it would be possible based on trust.
Well, exactly. That's what I was getting to in terms of having some arena or some venue for your works to be seen, so that it's known that these things are open and can be looked at by the public, but also that there's a degree of trust in their knowing, have some sense of what you do, and what you're doing with things that you, with the artifacts that you're creating.
I've used the images that I've made in the past as a sort of door to people's trust. And each time I make a successful image, I show this image, of course, back to the family and also to the other families that I'm working. Now I'm working with a particular community that's fairly closed, where the families are all the families of laborers who work in one particular company. So they're quite in touch with one another. And it's step by step. If I end up making one successful family portrait, I believe that this would lead me to the next one. And then I would have 10 that I could do something with publicly. I don't have 10. I don't even have one.
There's a question back there, I think. Laura? Yeah.
I have a question. You mentioned that you go back and return prints to the sitters. Is there, and Jan Arvis wasn't mentioned among the influences, but I wonder, I mean, she developed relationships with the people that she was photographing and went back repeatedly and photographed and rephotographed. Has that happened in your work, that there are particular individuals that, for whatever reason, are fascinating, so you re-photograph them, or?
There are some people I've been photographing for 25 years, from the first time I went to Egypt, where I just developed relationships that now we've sort of grown together over this period of time. By the same token, 11 years ago when I was making some of the images that you see, or 12, 13, 14 years ago when I was making these images and then were exhibited in 2000, State Security had me followed for 3 months. That is, they followed me around to all the neighborhoods where I worked. And what they did is they basically threatened and terrified the people I photographed. Those people didn't want to see me again. I was causing them problems. They didn't need a headache. They've got already a dozen headaches in their lives. And so they systematically tried to destroy my relationships with people.
Question two also related to photographing women and families and so on. I mean, it seems since the woman photographer was successful with this, that it's in the taking of the images that there's the problem. I'm curious about where the images go afterwards. Are they concerned about that? Are they? I mean, if they don't have access to galleries, and maybe they don't see books published and so on. Is that that's beyond the scope of what they're...
No, that's their every right to ask those questions.
Yeah.
And it's incumbent upon me to try to answer those questions. One of the things that I've done with the family portrait project that I'm working on now is to show them the film that I made that's downstairs now, to try to get them to understand why I'm making these images and why I may not make the most flattering image of them, but that this image is important or might be important in this context. That's only been possible since January 25th of last year. And I haven't reached anywhere. I'm still at point zero.
I have wanted to interject previously. I have in the past done a lot of work in the Amazon basin with Amerindians, even there for displays of photographs. It rains all the time. But I always would give people copies of the photographs. And it was so appreciated, especially when they had their children's photographs. And it was a tremendous bond. The only mistake I made once, I gave them a photo of somebody who had died, and they thought, of course, that was some sort of ghost. So there's a great deal of emotion involved, I think. I'm sure you must have found that.
Yes, there's a lot of that too. But I've also had people tear up the images I take back to them. They didn't like it. I have people kiss me and hug me. I have people who want to give me something in return, because in Egypt you don't give anyone anything for free. So they want this relationship, and I try to find ways to get out of that. Most of the time people are very appreciative of their image. And my deep sense is that most of the time people are also disappointed in the image that they see.
Do you think, given like you were speaking about a shift in the way that people perceive these photos since January 25th of last year, do you think, given that, there may be the possibility that you could have a gallery like this in Egypt, or a showing like this in Egypt, and it be more accepted? I mean, as an Egyptian, and here I love the pictures. I'm absolutely fascinated by the photos, and I've been to Cairo many times, and you don't really pay attention to all of these people that are around you. And I think it's fascinating that you have them here, and you're just looking at it, and that you see them. So I just wonder whether you think that there is hope that you'd be able to display these anytime soon in Egypt.
My hope is just to be able to make new work. This is made and it's finished. That's my hope. I have a threshold. Because of what happened over the last year, I have also a terrible sinking feeling that maybe in 2 years I won't be able to make the family portraits, and I'm trying to take advantage of this point in time. My hope is just to make new work.
Is there what's the reaction from other artists in Egypt? Is there any sense of appreciation of the work, or hostility towards the work?
I think I mentioned that young Egyptian art photographers are mostly not working in this style at all. I have two hypotheses for that. I don't know if either one is correct. One is that to do this kind of work, you have to accept the sort of very basic and painful social realities of the country. And until January 25th, 2011, I think the entire country was basically in denial of the fact that 60 or 70% of the population is poor. And of that 60 or 70%, 80% of those people are working class, poor people. They're working. The other reason is that this photography hasn't been fashionable. And if you're a young photographer interested in the arts and trying to get your work seen in galleries in Cairo and abroad, this isn't the style that you're going to pursue, not if you want your work to be seen. So I think those are the two reasons why others aren't working in this particular genre.
I have a question about maybe a tradition of commercial photography. Where do people go when they had a wedding portrait made or some life event that was documented? I presume there's a continuum in the society where the upper class had portrait photographers they could go to, might not have filtered down to the working class poor. Then where along that line they would be working a commercial photographer who has a shop that you said you were collecting portraiture from the Yasser period. But do they still exist at some level along this?
Yes, they do. They do, and there are studio photographers for every social class. They do exist, and it's de rigueur in Egypt not only to have a wedding portrait, but to have a wedding video. And you can be dirt poor, but you are not going to get married without the video being there. Um,
And a big wedding, I mean,
yes,
hundreds of people.
yes, if that's possible.
Yeah, it's not really, I just want to talk about the tourist aspect. I've been living in Egypt and I went back as a tourist. And I found the people extremely warm as far as taking pictures of them in any milieu, in the lowest area, from the Nubians to the lowest class. And I have beautiful connection and relationship with people. And I mean, maybe it's different because I'm European and I'm not a professional photographer. But as a tourist, I mean, I found it wonderful.
I think it's quite easy to photograph.
I also have a video of the entire tour I took. It was fantastic.
Again, anywhere in and around the tourist sites, photography is not only accepted, it's expected. That's not where I'm photographing.
No, I know that, but I said that was the other side of
Yeah.
the coin, you know.
You know, the question of politics was touched on. I have a very strong political response to it, I must say. I spoke to her earlier about what impressed me most of all, the sense of strength and dignity in the faces that I see. You know, this is a picture of the poor, but it's not a sentimental picture of the poor as victims. And, you know, it's looking at their faces and the courage that I see there, it's really the only thing that gives me hope in a world that's so totally crazy that, you know, people have this strength. You know, I don't know whether this is overly optimistic, but, you know, there is strength. You know.
I would say that the overwhelming experience that I've had with people in Egypt of all social classes is that this is the reason that I remain in Egypt. The strength of these people.
And that's a political fact of tremendous importance.
Yes, absolutely.
If there are no further, there is one
Sorry,
question.
one last question. Would you mind speaking a little bit more about your collection of 19th century photography or the previous studio photography, and if any influence that might have on your work, if you've looked at it as something that you can draw inspiration from, or as something possibly in some cases to avoid?
I don't have a collection of 19th century, but I have a collection of, let's say, early 20th century. From the 19 teens to the 1960s or so. I have maybe 4,000 or 5,000 photographs that I've collected over the last 15 or so years. I collect them because they're made usually by Egyptians, of Egyptians, and I'm interested in how people present themselves to the studio and what their sense of their public image is. And I'd always hoped to be able to sort of write about this. I never have, but I think, yes, that my collecting these pictures has definitely affected how I approach people, and it's a basic fact of photography that the way you approach people affects the image that you make. And I think that some of those studio photographs have helped me think about that.
Can I just ask where you collected them from? Is this from, I mean, are you taking things out of the trash, or or going to the studio photographers, or how? I just don't know.
We have an enormous and super interesting flea market in Egypt, and not, let's say, in the last 5 or 6 years, but when I first arrived in Egypt in the mid and late 90s, these photographs weren't valued at all, and so they were usually thrown out when a grandparent died. This was considered the junk that people wanted to get rid of. Because of the way Egypt is structured, nothing is thrown out. And these things end up at the booksellers, and I'm often at the booksellers, and I've been collecting old photographs as photographs, but also magazines for the photographs and for the caricatures, because an entirely different Egypt is presented in those images than images we see of Egypt today. And I just have done that over many, many years. And I'm privileged, one, to be able to find a lot of them. I'm privileged because I've made personal connections with the booksellers. So, they have this crazy guy who's willing to buy, 50 photographs in one shot. So they just give me a call. Hey, I have 50 photographs. Come and look at them. And I rush over.
One more question?
I just have a question about sort of the whole idea of galleries and putting these photos back to the communities that they photographed. So I know that a few new galleries have tried to open up in places that are less accessible or more accessible to the communities you are actually photographing. Something like, for example, those 17, 18. I'm not sure how you feel about these galleries. Do you think that they've sort of been fetishized, or do you think they're actually a space for that kind of mixture of the classes?
I know all the galleries that you're talking about, and do you know Archival? I know Mu'taz Nasr, the guy who runs Darb 17-18, and I know Hamdi Rida, who's running Art al-Liwa, and I have a very hard time seeing my work in that context. I have a real serious problem with those galleries and with all the private galleries in Cairo, except for maybe Safar Khan, which has no qualms about it being an aristocratic gallery. But the townhouse, I know William Wells, and I have a serious problem with showing my work at the townhouse, even though the townhouse has put together some very interesting exhibitions. But I'm not so enamored of the general philosophy of the townhouse or of the Mashrabiyya. And I understand that maybe the initial motivation of Darb 17, which is a gallery in Coptic Cairo, on the edges of quite a poor neighborhood. And in fact, those two photographs, the diagonal men who were in the working limestone, they are from that neighborhood. Darb 17 has made very little inroads into the local community. Very little. They're showing foreign, 50% of the shows are foreign artists who are showing in London and Paris and Barcelona, and these are now being taken into this community without any kind of intermediary. And I've had my disagreements with Mu'taz about that. It's a fantastic space, but I'm not very happy with what's been done with that space. Yeah.
Can I ask you mentioned there are 10 galleries, but are those showing exclusively photography, or is this all kinds of?
Even up until today, I'd say that most Egyptians don't think much of photography. At least they don't think of it as an art form. Certainly when I began photographing in Egypt in '86 and in the mid-'90s, nobody thought photography was an art form. There hadn't at that time been any young Egyptian photographer who had succeeded artistically. That's happened since. But for the overwhelming majority of Egyptians, I'd say no. Most of what's shown is other kinds of art, but not photography.
I think we will draw the discussion to a close. If you will join me in thanking Yasser Alwan for